Next keynote speaker is Assistant Professor Marcus Tan. Marcus is Assistant Professor for Visual and Performing Arts at the NIE. He specializes in intercultural theatre and performance acoustomologies, as well as soundscape studies. He has researched on digital performance and virtual reality theatre, including the use of VR for social emotional learning. Marcus will be sharing on how immersive technologies can be a pedagogical mode for teaching SEL in the classroom context. Please join me in welcoming Marcus. Marcus, please.
Thank you, Travina, for the generous introduction. Give me 2 seconds to just get my slides ready. So yes, I think it's up. So I'll be sharing with you today a recently concluded project that I did that looked at the use of VR, or in academic terms, we generally call them immersive virtual environments, so IVEs. So the project really was an exploration about the use of IVEs in the classroom context for the teaching of certain social and emotional skills. So there's a lot of discussion recently, of course, with Facebook's metaverse and on this transition to virtual learning in the last 2 or 3 years. So studies on VR and IVEs on aspects of social emotional learning have been done since the early 2010s, but they rarely are done in the context of a classroom. And certainly none have been done here. So this project was really among the first. I think it might be the first. And so it was really small scale in that sense, with intentions to expand the research in the near future. So I will begin the official presentation. So in Striking Vipers, an episode of the notable television series Black Mirror, the lead characters, Danny and Carl, experience the world of a fighting video game with state-of-the-art virtual reality. Their consciousness is transported into the Street Fighter-like world as they inhabit the bodies of the game avatars, and they can think, move, and feel within that virtual world. So while Danny and Carl are heterosexual males in real life, they seemingly become attracted to each other in the virtual world because Carl, the one that you see on the right, uses an attractive female avatar. These feelings they experience in the virtual realm then subsequently spill over into real life, into Danny and Carl's lives. And of course, it confounds them in various ways. It threatens their own marriage, their marriages, and so on. So Striking Vipers interrogates, of course, this is fictional, and the technology is not yet here. But Striking Vipers interrogates the impact of immersive VR's capacity to dissolve the distinction between the virtual and the real, because of its capacity to generate authentic, actual empathy and emotions. While virtual reality and immersive virtual environments are today still primarily a trademark of the video game industry, its application outside of entertainment is now being realized. So there are schools here that have experimented with it for social studies, geography and history, but not extensively done, of course. So IVE's characteristic of being able to place the user in the shoes of another and assume another person's or avatar's perspective in another space and time has encouraged educators to explore their pedagogical potential. So this study really responds to a local need for more creative, engaging, and realistic ways of teaching social and emotional learning. With the increased use of information technology in the classroom today, the rising popularity of VR environments as a tool to engage students in sensorially rich contexts for more embodied forms of experiential learnings, this exploratory small-scale project compared the effectiveness of IVEs with conventional modes of teaching, such as video viewing, so students watch a video, and pen and paper mental simulation. So that's just the academic phrasing of giving them a narrative or a text to read. The medium was also accompanied by realistic stories and identifiable protagonists, such that current social issues could be effectively communicated. As there has been no sustained study of the use of IVEs or VR in Singapore classroom context, this project using IVEs facilitated by wearable head-mounted displays, like you see there, aim to present preliminary findings about the effectiveness of IVEs in facilitating three aspects or three competencies: empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision making. So the research questions, as you can see on the screen, the research questions for this project were: one, which modality of the three is more effective in developing social awareness, specifically empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision making? And the second research question was: is immersive technology necessarily more effective than conventional current approaches of teaching social emotional competencies? Oops. Okay. So our research involves students in a local Singapore school who are in the third year of a 6-year integrated program, so they'll be in IP3. And they averaged at about 15 years of age. 75 students participated in the first session and 67 participated in the second. Even though we targeted the whole level, these were the numbers that gave consent. This age group was selected because the brain regions in charge of perspective taking have been documented to develop around this age in various studies that we have read. So since perspective taking has been linked to both empathy and responsible decision, it made sense for these brain developments to correspondingly lead to greater capacities for empathy and responsible decision making as well. So hence, it's reasonable to deduce that due to these brain developments, individuals of this age will be more responsive to efforts meant at increasing their socio-emotional competencies, including those put forth in this study. So this is the dry part of the presentation because of the methodology. There were 2 data collection sessions. Students were randomly grouped into 3 treatment groups. So immersive virtual environments, the 2D video viewing. So they just watched the video, and pen and paper mental simulation, which, as I earlier mentioned, they essentially read a narrative or the story itself. So each session was conducted as part of a regular CCE lesson. So we worked with the school to arrange for specific lessons that we could go in and conduct. The first session examined the topic of bullying faced by young Singaporeans today. The problem scenario depicted an incidence of bullying in school, in which the protagonist experienced being physically harassed and victimized online. The second session looked at the prevalent subject of social and income inequality in Singapore. And so the problem scenario allowed students to inhabit the role of a student from a low-income family who is faced with a dilemma about whether or not to find escort work, essentially, to supplement the impoverished family's income. So we worked with the school, specifically for these 2 scenarios, we worked with the school to address what were some of the things that they wanted to discuss in CCE, in their broader CCE curriculum. So these scenarios, all presented from the first-person perspective, were identical for all 3 treatments, although they were presented in their respective modalities. And our study essentially adopted the mixed method of approach to data collection, comprising of both quantitative and qualitative data. So just very quickly then, the quantitative measures included a pre- and post-test self-report questionnaire to measure the competencies of empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision-making, and we adapted current or instruments that were used in similar studies, though not in a classroom context. So the collection of qualitative data happened in 2 ways. The post-test included short answer questions, which required participants to respond to how they would attempt to resolve the problem presented in the scenario, so as to evaluate responsible decision-making. And there were questions as well included in the questionnaire that evaluated concepts of presence, immersion, and embodiment. To support findings from the short answer questionnaire, interviews were conducted with selected student participants based on purposive sampling methods. The purpose of the interviews was to seek more detailed responses to the questions about perspective taking and empathy in relation to the treatment conditions and how the treatment specifically impacted their selected solution to the problem presented. So quantitative findings, very briefly, because there's a lot of numbers here and I'm not good at numbers. So essentially my co-PI was the one that managed the quantitative analysis. The interaction effect for the 2-way repeated measures maneuver was not statistically significant for overall SEC development. Neither was the interaction effect for the three specific SECs. The main effect of intervention was not statistically significant as well. Examining both experimental sessions, participants from the 3 experimental conditions did not differ significantly from each other in terms of their overall levels of SEC development. The planned comparisons involving one-way ANOVAs and IVE revealed, however, a significant difference between the impact of IVE and those who did the pen and paper mental simulation on participants' perspective-taking levels, but only for the second scenario, the one that involved social and income inequality. So as the pen and paper mental simulation treatment was the only intervention to have recorded higher levels of SEC development on a statistically significant level in the study, the pen and paper mental simulation treatment is correspondingly the most effective intervention of the 3 examined in terms of facilitating higher levels of development. So because the quantitative findings were not very conclusive, except for what I just mentioned earlier, we relied more on the qualitative, which really revealed quite significant findings for us, so very interesting responses that they provided that sort of corroborated our initial hypothesis. So in terms of qualitative data, participants' responses revealed that IVEs had managed to facilitate perspective taking to the largest proportion of participants out of the 3 interventions for both scenario 1 and scenario 2. So making IVE the most effective intervention in terms of facilitating perspective taking for a greater percentage of participants. So likewise, IVE managed to facilitate empathy for the largest percentage of participants for both scenario 1 and scenario 2. IVE thus was the most effective intervention out of the 3 examined where facilitating empathy was concerned. In contrast, the pen and paper mental simulation seems to be the most effective intervention in facilitating responsible decision-making, with participants who experience this condition being the most likely to make responsible decisions and the least likely to make irresponsible ones for both scenarios. So I'll come back to this in a while and explain why this was the case, because this was the interesting finding. So in scenario 1, the team classified any aggressive retaliation against the bullies as a less responsible decision or irresponsible decision, and any action to seek help, to talk to a person of authority or to render assistance to others in a similar situation as a more responsible decision. So as you can see from the tabulated percentages, participants who experienced the pen and paper mental simulation, so those that read the story, were the most likely to make the responsible decision to help other victims of bullying and the least likely to engage in irresponsible retaliation strategies against the bullies, as you will see in the following slide here. So in the second scenario, the one involving social and income inequality, we classified avoiding work as a social escort being a more responsible decision and becoming a social escort as a less responsible choice. In this scenario, participants in the pen and paper mental simulation condition were again the most likely to make the more responsible decision not to become a social escort, and the least likely to make the less responsible decision to become one, as we will see in this slide. So with both scenarios considered, the pen and paper mental simulation condition or intervention facilitated responsible decision-making for the largest percentage of participants. So, of course, we're going on to the interviews and what we found from the interviews, which were really helpful in terms of understanding the qualitative data that we had. So there's also further evidence from the interview data that suggests why IVE can facilitate social emotional learning. So participants in the IVE condition affirmed that the modality provided them with more visual information about their surroundings and the storylines or the plots. So this led them to have a better understanding of the protagonist situation. That is, they were able to engage in more successful perspective taking, which in turn caused them to empathize with the protagonist more. So IVEs have also been observed to successfully generate empathy for the protagonists, with these feelings making the participants more motivated to undertake actions that help the protagonists. From this, it is possible that IVE's ability to generate empathy in participants increases the likelihood that users will engage in responsible decision making in real life, in the form of actual helping behaviors. Consequently, although pen and paper mental simulation was more successful in encouraging a greater proportion of participants to make responsible decisions, IVEs can potentially excel at translating participants' responsible decisions into actual real-life helping behaviors. And of course, this finding is in accordance with previous research that we have done, which found that IVEs were better able to encourage responsible behaviors in everyday life as compared to the pen and paper mental simulation. So the qualitative data overall reveals then how IVE has greater impacts on perspective taking and empathy in that it encourages these competencies for a higher percentage of participants. The qualitative data also reveals that IVEs lend to greater immersion, a deeper sense of presence and embodiment, since these are the key characteristics and strengths of IVEs. So I'll just pause here and explain immersion, presence, and embodiment a little bit, because I didn't quite touch on it earlier. So immersion really is a sense of, and of course it comes from the metaphor of being submerged in water, right? So in the context of virtual reality and IVE studies, immersion means that you are what is the sense of feeling that you're in that space, in a virtual space, and immersed in it, so surrounded by it. That's quite different from the sense of presence. So presence really is another way of talking about engagement. So do you feel present in that space? So you can feel present, but not necessarily immersed. So for example, if you read a story and you're very engaged in it, you feel present in the story, but you're not necessarily immersed in that world. It's a bit different. So embodiment, of course, is about the capacity to be able to feel like you have taken the perspective of another. Sometimes it also could be in terms of not just perspective, but sensations. So there are VR studies that involve tracking physical sensations as well. So that also constitutes as a kind of embodiment. So notably, our study also revealed links among these three concepts between immersion and presence, between presence and embodiment, as well as between embodiment and social and emotional learning. Specifically, the development of perspective taking and empathy, all of which align with previous literature on these topics. They prove that generating greater immersion, IVEs also generate higher levels of presence and embodiment, which then subsequently has positive impacts on perspective taking and empathy. Yet, while IVE appears to have more success in facilitating perspective taking and empathy for a larger percentage of participants, the pen and paper mental simulation seems to be more effective in facilitating higher levels of perspective taking. But this finding was only for the second scenario. And also in facilitating responsible decision making for a greater percentage of participants. Participants' short responses reveal that this could be due to pen and paper's descriptive nature, its informativeness, specifically with regards to the protagonist's thoughts and feelings, and its ability to facilitate deeper reflection regarding problem resolution. It is also possibly because emotional distance from the predicament of the problem is what allows one to make more rational choices, as opposed to the emotional involvement that may result from stronger perspective taking and deeper empathy. Such a view is affirmed by the short answer responses again, in which participants mentioned that the pen and paper mental simulation allowed them for emotional detachment from the situations that subsequently contributed to the ability to make better decisions. So considering that IVE and pen and paper mental simulation have positive impacts on different aspects of social and emotional learning, their abilities in facilitating SEL seem complementary. So IVEs allow for empathy and perspective taking, while the pen and paper mental simulation encourages responsible decision making. Concludingly, IVE presents immense potential for SEL and is used in the Singapore classroom given the high digital literacy rate in young students today, as well as the availability of such technologies which are increasingly less expensive and more cost-worthy. The medium's efficacy is recognizably dependent on many other variables, such as the storyline and engagement of the plot, the relatability of the protagonist, and other real-world conditions, such as the activities that come before and after the virtual experience. So these certainly require further investigation, especially with a study where IVEs use is sustained in the CCE curriculum over a course of a stipulated time. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marcus. Not just for sharing your project, but for reminding us that pen and paper is still important in this day and age, even as we wrestle with how to teach SEL more effectively.